Hello, I'm Joanne Serrieh. From the pressures of social media to the long shadow of the pandemic, young people today are navigating a mental health landscape unlike any before. And it's not just Gen Z. Millennials are also dealing with rising levels of anxiety, burnout, and emotional stress. So how did we get here? And more importantly, how do we move forward? To break down what's really going on inside the minds of today's youth and young adults, I'm joined by Dr. Jon Goldin, consultant in child and adolescent psychiatry. Dr. Goldin, thank you for joining me. Over your career as a child and adolescent psychiatrist, how have you seen the mental health landscape shift for young people?
Yeah, I've been a consultant child and adolescent psychiatrist for over 25 years, and during that time, I think it's fair to say that there has been a very clear increase in mental health difficulties amongst children and young people. Now, there's various reasons for that. One thing is that we are recognizing things more, we're picking things up more, and I think young people are also more open to talking about their difficulties that they're facing. So rather than kind of suffering in silence, young people are seeking help or they're talking to their parents or their friends or teachers at school. So we're more aware of the kind of difficulties that young people are facing. So that's one of the factors. But I think in general, it's quite hard being a young person in today's society. From a sort of political point of view, there's greater gaps between rich and poor, and there's bigger socioeconomic divides, certainly in the UK and elsewhere in the world. And we know that poverty is associated with poor mental health. And when your parents are struggling to pay the bills and there are socioeconomic difficulties at home, that can be associated with poor mental health. Another big factor is social media, and we know that social media puts pressures on young people. There are good things about social media as well, but we do know that in the last 15 years or so that smartphones and social media have become more part of young people's lives. We know the kind of increased pressures that they're under, and I'm sure we'll talk about that in more detail in a little while. Um, I think also, just getting back to the economic side of things, it's the first time that young people, certainly in the UK, are less well off socioeconomically than their parents. And I think also young people look to the future and they think, what kind of future world am I going to grow up in and live in? Uh, Politics is very divided, things are getting very polarized. In that kind of way, we see a lot of wars and adults, doing things that young people think, why are they doing that? What kind of future am I going to have? There's the issue of things like climate change that is very important to young people, but they probably feel that adults are not taking it as seriously as they should do. So there are various things that are quite stressful for young people when they look to the future that can make them feel quite pessimistic and maybe the rise of AI and worries about what kind of jobs they're going to be able to do in the future. So quite a few different things are making things difficult for young people today.
You did mention social media. I do want to talk about that for a bit. TikTok and similar platforms are designed to be highly addictive. What kind of impact are you seeing this have on children and teens in terms of attention span, sleep, and overall mental well-being?
Yeah, I think in terms of attention span, social media does not help people sustain their attention. So young people these days are not reading books, for example, as much as they used to. I don't think because they're more likely to be looking at, short form videos, as you say, on TikTok or on Instagram. And so their brain is not being trained to sort of sustain attention in the way that hopefully it was in the past when, young people were doing things like reading more. So they're used to, seeing something that's kind of entertaining for like 20 seconds, and then the algorithm that you mentioned shows the next thing immediately. So they're moving from one thing to the next. It's designed to keep them on the platform. These social media companies, they basically want to get our data, and they want, the more time we spend on their platforms, the more time young people spend on their platforms as well, the more data they get, the more revenue they get from advertising. So I do think that social media companies should prioritize the mental health of young people much more than they do. And I think their real priority is the bottom line, making money. And unfortunately, they're making money often at the expense of young people's mental health.
Another big concern with social media, I would say, on platforms like Instagram, for example, they create this culture of comparison, right? Then you have users mostly sharing their best moments and not much negative content from their own personal lives. How does this shape self-esteem and identity in adolescence?
I think it's hard when you're a young person sitting at home looking at images of, glamorous men and women doing exciting things, and then you compare your life with the images that you see online, and it compares unfavorably very often because, as you say, people put their sort of uh, best foot forward when it comes to social media, and often things are photoshopped that young people might not be aware that they've been photoshopped. So people look in a way, their image is kind of unrealistic for young people to achieve in a sort of day-to-day sense. And so they compare themselves unfavorably. This affects their self-esteem, and they feel that they're not good enough, that they don't match up. And often this is happening, when they're on their own in their bedroom, looking at this through this screen at this world that's out there. And it can make them feel quite low and quite depressed and quite anxious that they can't keep up with what they're seeing. And it's not good, obviously, for their mental health to have that unfavorable comparison.
Given the digital world isn't going away anytime soon, what practical steps can parents and schools or even these platforms take to better protect young minds without completely cutting them off from this online social life that they have?
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to be able to put the genie back in the bottle, as it were. So we can't turn the clock back. So we do need to learn how to manage social media. And I think it's very important that parents and adults and educators know what young people are looking at online and leave the lines of communication open for young people to talk to their parents or their teachers or trusted adults about what they're seeing. Things they might be seeing things that are quite upsetting for them. Young people as young as 7 or 8 might be looking at quite graphic pornography. I mean, that is happening way more than it should do, and that's upsetting for them, and that will affect their views of relationships between men and women and so on. So it's very important that when they're concerned or worried about things that they're seeing, that they do have the opportunity to talk to adults about them. As I say, the lines of communication really need to be open. And one of the ways that social media affects the young people's mental health in a detrimental way is through sleep and lack of exercise. So if you're spending a lot of time online looking at your phone, especially if it's late at night, you're not getting the sleep that you need. And we know that a good night's sleep is very associated with good mental health. So I often recommend that young people should put their phones away for at least an hour before bedtime. And I say this to parents that maybe it would be helpful if the whole family does that. So the whole family can charge their phones in the kitchen or something like that from a certain time in the evening, 9:30 or 10 p.m. or whatever is decided in that particular family. And the parents can model that. I mean, young people look to their parents as role models. And if their parents are looking at their phone late at night in bed and so on, the young people are more likely to do it themselves. So if you do not look at a screen for at least an hour before bedtime, that's likely to increase your chances of having a good night's sleep. So that's something I recommend. The other thing we talk about is green time rather than screen time. So green time means time out in nature, walking in a park, getting some fresh air, and we try to encourage more green time rather than too much screen time. Young people will look at screens, but we need to try and find a balance. The other thing I want to mention as well is in the UK, we have an online harms bill that has gone through Parliament and is currently being implemented. And the government are trying to put pressure on social media providers to take, for example, graphic images of self-harm or references to suicide or sites that promote eating disorders, these kind of sites that are unhelpful for young people's mental health. They're trying to encourage Instagram and Facebook and TikTok and so on to take down these sites and to police their sites more carefully. And they certainly are capable of doing this. They have the technology. Currently, they don't do age verification adequately. These companies can certainly police who is on their sites, but they're not doing it adequately. So, for example, we need much better age verification on TikTok, Instagram, Snapchat, and so on.
I think we can shift a bit from social media and briefly touch on the COVID-19 lockdown experience. When it comes to the younger generation, how did years of these types of restrictions and sometimes even long isolation periods affect their mental health and in terms of social development and anxiety?
The COVID lockdown was a very difficult time for many young people and families across the globe, obviously. And I think one of the things that was particularly difficult in the UK for young people and elsewhere was missing out on school. So schools were often shut for quite prolonged periods of time, and children were not able to go to school. They weren't able to get the normal education that they needed to receive, and they also weren't able to socialize with other young people. So quite a few of the patients that I see nowadays, they look back on those couple of years of the COVID time, the COVID pandemic, and they think that really was not helpful for their mental health. They were stuck at home often. They were not able to see their friends. They were not able to get out to school, as I say. It was a very anxious time as well. Relatives might be unwell or even dying. The numbers of people that were dying at the time were very inflated, sadly, and many children and young people knew someone, perhaps a close relative even, who had died. And they also pick up on the anxiety of their parents. So, fathers and mothers, their jobs were at risk. They weren't earning money in the same way that they normally might do when there is not a pandemic. So there was a lot of anxiety. And also, of course, anxiety about the pandemic as well in itself. So there was a lot of anxiety nationally and throughout the world, and young people picked up on that. So it was a very difficult time for a range of reasons, missing out on education, missing out on socialization, and great anxiety all around us.
How does this phase of missing out on so much, whether they're missing out on school or they missed out on social experiences, how will that affect these children from this generation in the real world as adults?
Well, we hope that there's not lasting damage done, but the reality is does increase challenges for young people when they've missed out on a year or two of their education. So we know that, young people who are doing exams and studying at a later stage in their school career suffered because they missed out on education during the COVID pandemic. So it doesn't necessarily have to mean that there's long-term damage done, but children and young people develop, and to some extent that period of time their opportunities to develop were restricted. They didn't have, if you were age 3, 4, 5, and normally you'd be in a play group, learning how to play, learning how to interact with other young people of your age, you were stuck at home usually at that time for that 2 year period or much of that 2 year period. So normal opportunities to develop and socialize were missed out on, which means that young people have to catch up at a later stage. So one hopes that for the majority of young people, it doesn't affect them in a major way into their adulthood and into their, professional careers and so on. But I do think it makes it more stressful to, for example, study at the age of 11, 12, 13 when you've missed out on school at the age of 5 or 6. So, there have been significant impacts, but we also don't want to be too pessimistic and think that it's, caused definite long-term damage, because I don't think we can say that for sure.
We've been talking about younger children, so let's shift a little bit to talk about millennials. Why do we hear so much about this generation as being more anxious compared to others, whether they're younger or older?
As I said earlier, I do think that young people are talking more openly about their mental health challenges, and it's really good that the stigma has reduced. We have more actors and sports people and, well-known celebrities who are talking more openly about if they feel depressed or anxious. And I think that's a positive thing. I think it's particularly important for males to feel that they can. I mean, it's obviously important for females as well, but I think males struggle with this more sometimes. Uh, Saying when they feel down, when they need help, when they're feeling anxious. And males, to some extent, are getting better at this. There's obviously a lot of challenges that boys face, in particular, in relation to what it means to be a male in today's society. But people are talking more openly, and I think that's a positive thing. So I think that's one reason why we might say this is the anxious generation, because people are talking more openly about it. But I do also think that the things we've talked about already, like social media and comparing yourself unfavorably with people that you see online and the kind of pressures to get lots of likes when you put a post out there, these kind of things are putting increased pressure on young people, and I think it makes them anxious. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have a more anxious generation of young people at the moment.
So you're saying millennials and younger generations are talking more openly about mental health. Do you also think therapy and mental health tools have become more normalized among younger generations? This is compared to older generations, or are they still facing some stigmas?
I think there's still some stigma associated with it, and we need to continue to sort of challenge the stigma of having mental health difficulties. I mean, everyone is prone to having mental health difficulties at different points in their lives. We need to distinguish, normal unhappiness and sadness and normal kind of anxiety from pathological depression or anxiety disorder. And the ways that we distinguish that are things like how much is it impacting on your life. And I think it's really important that we do say to young people and to each other that, being anxious sometimes is a perfectly normal thing to do. In fact, it's actually a helpful thing to be anxious when you're facing an exam because, for example, or a sports event or something that you need to perform at, because anxiety helps increase your performance to a certain extent. But if you have too much anxiety, it can impact on your day-to-day functioning and it can become a kind of disorder which needs the right help and support. I think young people are more open to receiving therapy, to receiving help than perhaps the previous generation 20 or 30 years ago were, and that's a really positive thing.
With Gen Z coming up behind them, do you think millennials are paving the way for a more emotionally literate generation?
I think the direction of travel is for people generally to be more able to talk about their feelings and as you say, to have a more kind of emotionally literate generation. I think that's a really positive thing. And I think that is one of the positive developments that we've had over the last 10 or 15 years. Uh, However, the rise of social media and the way society is moving is also in a more kind of polarized direction. I think we've seen that there's less nuance around, less kind of gray areas, more black and white. You either believe one thing or you believe the opposite thing. And I think that's a real concern, and young people can get somewhat drawn into that. I've seen young males, for example, get drawn into a very kind of polarized view of what it is to be a man, and very unhelpful influencers like Andrew Tate and so on. We can discuss that if you want to in more detail, but following role models who are really not very helpful, and that is a real concern when that kind of thing happens. So I think it's a mixed picture. In some ways, things are really developing in a helpful way. Young people are becoming more emotionally literate, more able to access help, more able to talk about their feelings when they're feeling low or anxious, more able to get support. But at the same time, they're also drawn into this world which is more polarized, and that aspect of society is not a helpful development, I don't think.
I do want to hear more about that from you, Dr. Goldin. With figures like Andrew Tate being so popular among young boys and even young men, and then there was the hit show Adolescence on Netflix. Tell me more about how such figures and experiences are affecting this generation.
Well, I think some boys don't know what it is to be a man or what masculinity involves, and they're struggling with that. And I think it's really, really important that they have positive male role models. And, a significant number of young people grow up without, one parent in there at home. Often it's the man who's not at home. So we have boys growing up in families where they might not see their father so much, or their father might be living somewhere else, or they might not see him at all in the worst case scenarios. Um, so so I think that that's really difficult for many boys, that they don't have the opportunity that would be helpful to them to have positive male role models. And then in the absence of that, they might be in their room looking at their phone on Instagram or whatever and seeing people like Andrew Tate saying, this is what it is to be a man. But if you look at some of the stuff he's put out there, it's extremely worrying. He's talked about violence against women, and you need to dominate them and you need to show them who's boss and all this kind of thing, which if you're a young boy, you might be drawn into that. You might think, oh, okay, this is how I need to be a man. But it's obviously an extremely unhelpful role model to follow. So what we do need is more positive male role models around for boys in today's society.
And what can be done in this case when, as you're saying, some boys don't have these role models in their lives and their only resource would be social media and what's being pushed in terms of content in front of them? What could be done to help this future generation?
Well, I think it's really important that, society provides good facilities for young people. So sport is a really good opportunity to work as a team, to have good positive role models, to meet other people, to be healthy physically, and get out in fresh air. So I think, sports facilities, sports clubs should be more widely available at lower cost for young people to take part in. Um, Similarly, youth clubs, uh, opportunities for young people to, get out of the home, meet positive adult role models, and meet other young people in a kind of healthy way. face-to-face interactions, either in the family or in society more broadly, are protective for young people's mental health. Being stuck in your bedroom looking at your phone all the time is not protective for your mental health. So we need to sort of shift the balance in that kind of way. And I think governments and society generally should be paying more attention to the well-being of young people. I mean, after all, they're the next generation, they're the future of our society, and we should be looking after them a lot more than we have been doing thus far.
Dr. Goldin, I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for your time and your insights. And to the viewers, thank you for joining me. See you next time.